The threadbare dress hanging on Margaret Norton's thin frame had been mended so many times that the original fabric was barely visible beneath the patches when she stepped off the dusty stagecoach into Jordan Valley, Oregon, in the spring of 1878. She clutched a small cloth bundle containing everything she owned in this world, her knuckles white from gripping it so tightly, and scanned the rough collection of wooden buildings that made up the frontier town with eyes that had learned long ago not to hope for much. The position as a cook at the logging camp, 15 miles north, was her last chance after the textile mill back in Pennsylvania had closed its doors forever, leaving her without work, without family, and without any reason to stay in a place that had never felt like home. Margaret was 22 years old, though the hardship etched into her features sometimes made her appear older in certain lights. Her dark blonde hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her hands were roughened from years of labor. She had never owned anything new in her entire life. Every dress, every pair of shoes, every undergarment had belonged to someone else first. Even the thin silver ring her mother had given her before dying of consumption when Margaret was 14 had been passed down through 3 generations before reaching her fingers. It was a life of hand-me-downs and making do, of wearing clothes until they literally fell apart, of going without so others could have enough. The stagecoach driver, a grizzled man with tobacco-stained teeth, hefted her single-worn carpetbag from the top of the coach and dropped it in the dirt at her feet. "Logging camp is that way," he said, pointing north toward the distant mountains. "But you best wait until morning. Ain't safe for a woman alone on that road after dark." Margaret nodded, her stomach twisting with anxiety. She had exactly $3.40 to her name, hardly enough for a room at the boarding house she could see down the street. "Is there someplace I might wait?" "Perhaps work for my supper and a place to sleep." The driver shrugged and climbed back onto his perch. "Try the general store. Owner's wife sometimes needs help." With a crack of his whip, the stagecoach lurched forward, leaving Margaret standing alone in the settling dust. The general store was a solid structure with a false front that made it appear grander than it was. Margaret pushed open the door, and a small bell announced her arrival. The interior was dim after the bright sunlight outside, and it took her eyes a moment to adjust. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with goods that represented civilization in this remote corner of Oregon. Canned foods, fabric, tools, ammunition, and medicines. A woman in her 50s looked up from behind the counter, her sharp eyes taking in Margaret's shabby appearance with a single glance. "Help you? I was wondering if you might need assistance, madam. I am waiting until morning to travel to the logging camp, and I would gladly work in exchange for supper and a place to sleep." The woman's expression softened slightly. "You the new cook they've been waiting for?" "Yes, madam." "Margaret Norton. Well, I suppose I could use help sorting the new shipment in the back. My husband's laid up with a bad leg and I am behind on everything. You work hard and I will give you supper and let you sleep in the storage room." "Fair, more than fair, madam. Thank you." The next several hours passed in steady labor. Margaret sorted through crates of goods, organized shelves, swept floors, and helped the occasional customer. The storekeeper's wife, Mrs. Henderson, watched her with approval, noting how efficiently Margaret worked and how she never complained or asked for breaks. When the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Mrs. Henderson locked the front door and led Margaret to the kitchen in their living quarters behind the store. Supper was simple but filling: beans, cornbread, and salt pork. Margaret ate slowly, making it last, savoring every bite. Mr. Henderson, a stocky man with his bandaged leg propped on a chair, asked her questions about her journey west and her plans. She answered honestly but without elaboration. There was no point dwelling on the past. "The logging camp is rough," Mr. Henderson said, his weathered face serious. 30 men, all of them hard workers but harder drinkers. The foreman is decent enough, but you will need to keep your wits about you. "I can handle myself, sir." "I do not doubt it," he replied, studying her. "But there is one man you should know about. Goes by Ryder Fallon. Mountain man who brings in game for the camp and works as a timber faller when the mood strikes him. Keeps to himself mostly, has a cabin up in the high country. Some say he is half wild, but he has never caused trouble in town." Margaret filed the information away. "Thank you for the warning." Mrs. Henderson prepared a bundle of food for Margaret's journey the next morning, refusing payment. "You worked hard today. Consider it a fair trade." That night, lying on a pile of blankets in the storage room, Margaret stared at the darkness and wondered what awaited her at the logging camp. She had survived worse than rough men and hard work. She would survive this too. The sun was barely cresting the eastern mountains when Margaret began her walk north. The road was little more than a rutted track carved through the sagebrush and grassland, winding gradually upward toward the timbered slopes in the distance. She carried her carpetbag in one hand and the bundle of food in the other, her stride steady despite the unfamiliar weight. Birds called from the scattered juniper trees, and a cool breeze carried the scent of pine from the higher elevations. She had been walking for perhaps 2 hours when she heard the sound of hoofbeats behind her. Margaret moved to the side of the road, keeping her eyes down as a rider approached. She had learned young that drawing attention to herself rarely ended well. "You headed to the logging camp?" a deep voice asked. Margaret looked up and felt her breath catch. The man on horseback was unlike anyone she had ever seen. He was massive, with shoulders so broad they seemed to block out the sun. His hair was dark brown and fell past his collar in thick waves, and his face was all hard angles and weathered tan skin. He wore buckskin pants and a simple cotton shirt that strained across a chest muscled from years of hard physical labor. His arms were thick with muscle, his hands large and calloused where they rested on the saddle horn. Everything about him spoke of raw strength and power barely contained. "Yes, sir," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. His eyes, she noticed, were an unusual gray-green like deep water under storm clouds. They studied her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "Long walk for someone carrying luggage. Climb up. I will give you a ride." Margaret hesitated. Mr. Henderson's words echoed in her mind. Mountain man, half wild, but her feet were already aching and she had miles yet to go. "That is kind of you, sir, but I do not wish to impose." Something that might have been amusement flickered across his face. "Not an imposition. Camp is expecting their new cook. You die of exhaustion on the road, and they will have my hide for not helping." He shifted forward in the saddle and extended his hand down to her. Ryder Fallon. So this was the man Mr. Henderson had warned her about. Margaret looked at his outstretched hand, noting the scars across his knuckles, the sheer size of his palm. She made her decision and reached up, letting him pull her up behind him with an ease that suggested her weight was nothing to him. She settled onto the horse's broad back, her bag clutched in her lap, trying to ignore the solid warmth of his body in front of her. "Hold on," Ryder said, and urged the horse forward at a steady trot. Margaret gripped the back of the saddle, maintaining a careful distance between them. The horse's gait was smooth, eating up the miles with far more efficiency than her tired feet. Ryder did not speak, and Margaret was grateful for the silence. She was acutely aware of him, of the way his muscles moved beneath his shirt, of the faint scent of pine and wood smoke that clung to him. After perhaps 30 minutes, Ryder spoke without turning his head. "You got people back east, No, sir, no one. Just Ryder, no need for sir. Margaret Norton, she offered, then felt foolish. He had not asked for her name. I know. Henderson sent word you were coming. He paused. What brings a woman alone all the way out here? Work, Margaret said simply. Same as most folks, I imagine. She felt rather than saw him nod. Fair enough. They rode in silence for another stretch. The road climbed steadily now, entering the pine forests that covered the mountain slopes. The air grew cooler and sweeter, filled with the scent of resin and damp earth. Margaret glimpsed deer moving through the trees and heard the distant drumming of a woodpecker. Camp can be rough, Ryder said eventually. Men get hungry, they get loud about it. You stand your ground, do not let them push you around. Foreman is Hank Miller. Good man, but he cannot be everywhere at once. You have trouble, you find me. Margaret stiffened. I can take care of myself. Did not say you could not, but knowing where help is when you need it is not weakness. It is survival. She considered his words and found them reasonable. Thank you. I will remember that. The logging camp appeared around a bend in the road, a collection of rough-hewn log buildings arranged in a clearing carved from the forest. There were 2 long bunkhouses, a cook's shack with a stone chimney, a barn for the horses and oxen, and several smaller structures for storage and other purposes. Stacks of cut timber lined one side of the clearing, and the sound of axes and saws echoed from deeper in the woods. Ryder rode directly to the cook's shack and dismounted with fluid grace, then reached up to help Margaret down. His hands spanned her waist easily, and he lifted her as if she weighed nothing. The moment her feet touched the ground, he released her and stepped back, maintaining a respectful distance. Ryder, that the new cook, a voice called. A man emerged from the cook's shack, wiping his hands on a stained apron. He was lean and wiry, probably in his late 40s, with graying hair and a weathered face. About damn time. I've been doing double duty for 3 weeks now. Margaret Norton, this is Sam Kowalski. He has been filling in since the last cook ran off, Ryder said. Sam looked Margaret up and down with a critical eye. You know your way around a kitchen? Yes, sir. I have been cooking since I was 10 years old. Can you handle feeding 30 hungry men 3 times a day, 7 days a week? I can, Sam grunted. We will see. Come on, I will show you around. He glanced at Ryder. You staying for supper, might be. Bring fresh meat if you do, Sam said, then disappeared into the cook's shack. Margaret grabbed her bag and turned to follow, but Ryder's voice stopped her. Margaret. She looked back at him. He was standing beside his horse, one hand on the animal's neck, his expression serious. You need anything, my cabin is about 3 miles up the mountain, due north. Or I am in camp most days. Remember what I said. I will. Thank you for the ride. He nodded once, mounted his horse, and rode off toward the tree line. Margaret watched him go, feeling strangely bereft once he disappeared into the forest shadows. The cook's shack was larger than she had expected, with a massive cast iron stove, long preparation tables, shelves stocked with supplies, and a separate pantry. Sam showed her everything with the efficiency of someone eager to hand over responsibility. There was a small room at the back with a narrow cot, a washstand, and a trunk for her belongings. It was sparse but clean, and it would be hers alone. After years of sleeping in crowded tenement rooms and boarding houses, the privacy felt like unimaginable luxury. You cook breakfast at 5, dinner at noon, supper at 6, Sam explained. Men eat in the mess hall next door. They are loud, they are crude, but they do not mean harm by it mostly. You keep the food hot and plentiful and they will love you. You serve them cold beans and burnt biscuits and they will make your life hell. Understood? Foreman comes by after breakfast to go over supplies and such. You need something from town, you put it on the list, and the wagon goes down every 2 weeks. Sam untied his apron and handed it to her. "It is all yours now. I got timber to fall and no more time for kitchen work." Margaret took the apron, noting the stains and worn fabric. Like everything else in her life, it had belonged to someone else first. She tied it around her waist and surveyed her new domain. The stove needed cleaning, the floor could use a good scrubbing, and she would need to inventory the pantry to see what she had to work with. But it was work she knew, work she was good at, and it came with steady pay and a roof over her head. She set her bag in her room and rolled up her sleeves. There was supper to prepare. The men began filing into the mess hall promptly at 6, drawn by the smell of frying meat and fresh bread. Margaret had found bacon, potatoes, and the ingredients for biscuits in the pantry. It was simple fare, but she had made plenty of it, and she had taken care with the preparation. The biscuits were golden and fluffy, the bacon crispy, the potatoes seasoned with wild onions she had found growing near the wood pile. She stood behind the serving counter as the men lined up with their plates, ladling out portions with quick efficiency. They stared at her with open curiosity, some making comments to each other in voices that carried easily to where she stood. Margaret kept her face neutral and her eyes on her work, neither encouraging nor discouraging their attention. "Quite an improvement over Sam's cooking," one man said with a grin as she filled his plate. "Prettier to look at too," another added, earning a chorus of rough laughter. Margaret said nothing, just continued serving. She had learned long ago that responding to such comments only encouraged more. Better to remain silent and let them get used to her presence. Ryder Fallon appeared near the end of the line, carrying a brace of rabbits which he handed to Margaret. "For tomorrow," he said quietly, "thank you." She took the rabbits, their bodies still warm, and set them aside. When she turned back to fill his plate, she made sure to give him generous portions. He caught her eye briefly, and she thought she saw approval in his gaze before he moved on to find a seat. Margaret watched him settle at a table in the corner, away from the main group of men. They gave him space, she noticed, speaking to him only in brief exchanges and never pushing for more conversation. He ate quickly and efficiently, then left without lingering. After the men had cleared out, Margaret cleaned the serving area, washed the dishes, and prepared the rabbits for the next day's stew. It was nearly 9 o'clock when she finally extinguished the lamps and retreated to her small room. She changed into her nightdress, a thin cotton garment that had been patched and mended countless times, and crawled into the narrow cot. Every muscle in her body ached from the long day of travel and work, but it was a good ache, the kind that came from honest labor. She had a job, a place to sleep, and food to eat. It was more than she had dared hope for just a few weeks ago. As she drifted off to sleep, her last thought was of Ryder Fallon's gray-green eyes and the quiet strength in his voice when he had told her to find him if she needed help. The days fell into a rhythm. Margaret rose before dawn to stoke the stove and prepare breakfast. The men came to rely on her hearty meals: oatmeal with molasses, eggs when available, bacon or salt pork, endless batches of biscuits, and strong coffee. At noon, she served dinner, usually a stew or beans with cornbread. Supper varied depending on what was available, but she always made sure there was plenty. Ryder brought game several times a week: rabbits, deer, sometimes grouse or quail. He never stayed long, never made conversation beyond the necessary, but Margaret found herself watching for him, listening for the distinctive sound of his boots on the wooden steps. He was different from the other men, quieter and more self-contained, moving with a confidence that needed no assertion. 2 weeks after her arrival, Hank Miller, the foreman, stopped by the cook's shack after breakfast. He was a solid man in his 50s with iron gray hair and a direct manner. "You are doing good work, Miss Norton. Men are happy with the food, and I have not heard any complaints about you, which is saying something." "Thank you, sir." "Supply wagon goes to town tomorrow. You need anything, write it down." He paused, studying her. "You settling in all right? Men treating you proper?" "Yes, sir. No problems," he nodded. "Good, you keep it that way. Any man gives you trouble, you come tell me immediately." After he left, Margaret took stock of the pantry and made her list. They needed flour, sugar, lard, dried beans, coffee, and spices. As she wrote, she noticed her hands, red and rough from constant work in hot water and harsh lye soap. Her nails were broken and ragged. She had never been vain about her appearance, but something about the state of her hands bothered her today. They looked like what they were: the hands of someone who had worked hard her entire life and never had anything left over for small luxuries. She pushed the thought aside and finished her list. Such things were not for people like her. That evening, Ryder appeared at the back door of the cook's shack just as Margaret was finishing the supper dishes. She looked up in surprise, her hands dripping soapy water. "Is something wrong? Need to talk to you." His expression was serious. Margaret dried her hands on her apron and stepped outside. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. The evening air was cool and fresh after the heat of the kitchen. "What is it?" Ryder looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight. "There is talk among some of the men." "Nothing serious yet, but you should be aware. A few of them think because you are alone here you might be amenable to company." Heat flooded Margaret's cheeks, but she kept her voice steady. "I am not. I figured. Just wanted to make sure you knew so you are not caught by surprise. And I told them any man who bothers you answers to me." She looked up at him, at the hard set of his jaw and the protective gleam in his eyes. Something warm unfurled in her chest, something she had not felt in a very long time. "You did not have to do that." "Yeah, I did." His voice was rough. "You are here alone, trying to do your job. You deserve to be left in peace." "Why?" Margaret asked suddenly. "Why do you care?" Ryder was silent for a long moment, his eyes searching her face. "Because nobody should have to fight every damn day just to be left alone. Because you work hard and do not cause trouble. Because—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "Just be careful, Margaret. Keep your door locked at night." He turned to leave, but Margaret's voice stopped him. "Ryder," he looked back, "thank you for looking out for me." Something softened in his rugged features. "Anytime." After he left, Margaret stood in the gathering darkness, her heart beating faster than it should. She barely knew the man, but his protective instincts touched something deep inside her, something she had thought long dead. She had learned not to rely on anyone, not to expect kindness or consideration. But Ryder Fallon kept defying those expectations. She went inside, locked her door as he had suggested, and lay awake in the darkness thinking about gray-green eyes and gentle hands that could probably snap a man in half if needed. The next morning, the supply wagon rumbled out early, driven by one of the camp workers. Margaret was too busy with breakfast to pay it much attention. The day passed like any other, cooking, cleaning, preparing meals, managing her kitchen with quiet efficiency. It was late afternoon when the wagon returned, loaded with supplies. Margaret was pulling a pan of cornbread from the oven when Hank Miller knocked on the door frame. "Got your supplies, Miss Norton. I will have the boys bring them in." "Thank you." She set the cornbread on the cooling rack and wiped her hands. Two men hauled in the sacks of flour and beans, the tins of lard, the bundles of other goods. Margaret checked each item against her list, making sure everything had arrived. "There is one more thing," Hank said, sounding puzzled. "Was not on your list, but it has your name on it." He handed her a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Margaret stared at it, confused. "There must be some mistake. I did not order anything." Says your name right there. Margaret Norton. With trembling fingers, Margaret untied the string and peeled back the paper. Inside was a wooden box, simple but beautifully made from smooth pine. She lifted the lid and gasped. Nestled inside was a pair of leather work gloves, clearly handmade. The leather was soft and supple, dyed a rich brown. The stitching was precise and even, showing hours of careful work. But what made her throat tighten and her eyes burn was that they were clearly made to fit her hands. Not large men's gloves that she would have to make do with, but gloves sized for her smaller fingers, her narrower palms. She had never owned a pair of gloves in her life. She had never owned anything made specifically for her. With shaking hands, she lifted one glove from the box. The leather was incredibly soft, worked to butter like suppleness. She slipped her right hand inside and felt the perfect fit, the way it hugged her fingers without being tight, the way the palm curved to match her own. It was like being touched by gentle hands. "Someone sweet on you?" Hank asked, amused. Margaret could not speak past the lump in her throat. She pulled on the second glove, flexing her fingers, marveling at how they felt. Protected, cared for, valuable enough for someone to spend time and money creating something beautiful just for her. She knew who had done this. She did not know how Ryder had managed it, how he had gotten her measurements, how he had arranged for the gloves to be made, but she knew with absolute certainty that these came from him. "I need to." She pulled off the gloves with careful reverence and placed them back in the box. "I need to find someone. Can you watch the stove for just a few minutes?" Hank looked surprised but nodded. "Sure thing." Margaret did not even take off her apron. She left the cook shack and headed for the tree line where she had seen Ryder disappear so many times. She followed a path that led into the forest, her heart pounding. She had no idea where his cabin was, only that it was somewhere to the north. She had been walking for perhaps 10 minutes when she heard the sound of an axe biting into wood. She followed the sound through the trees until she emerged into a small clearing. Ryder was there, his shirt hanging from a nearby branch, his powerful torso bare and gleaming with sweat as he split logs with methodical precision. The muscles in his back and shoulders flexed with each swing, his body a study in controlled power. "Ryder," Margaret called. He turned, surprise flickering across his face. He set down the axe and grabbed his shirt, pulling it on as he walked toward her. "Margaret, what is wrong?" She stopped a few feet away from him, suddenly uncertain. "The gloves, they were from you." It was not a question, but he nodded anyway. "Yeah, how did you? Why did you?" "Saw your hands," he said simply. "Saw how rough they were, how the cold water and lye soap were eating at them. Figured you could use some protection." He shifted uncomfortably. "Took measurements while you were sleeping. Your old gloves from your bag." "I do not have gloves. I have never had gloves." He looked at her sharply. "Never." "Never owned anything new before," Margaret whispered, her voice breaking. "Everything I have ever had belonged to someone else first. Clothes, shoes, everything. But these, you made these just for me, for my hands." Ryder stepped closer, his expression intense. "You deserve new things, Margaret. You deserve things made just for you." Tears spilled down her cheeks before she could stop them. She pressed her hands to her face, mortified by her loss of control. She never cried, had not cried in years, but something about this gift, about his simple declaration that she deserved nice things, broke through all her carefully maintained defenses. "Hey," Ryder said softly, and then his arms were around her, pulling her against his broad chest. "Hey, it is all right." Margaret stood rigid for a moment, then crumbled, sobbing into his shirt. He held her gently despite his massive strength, one hand cradling the back of her head, the other wrapped around her back. He smelled of pine and sweat and wood smoke, and his heart beat strong and steady beneath her ear. "I am sorry," she gasped between sobs. "I do not know what is wrong with me." "Nothing is wrong with you," Ryder murmured. "Sometimes kindness hits harder than cruelty. I know." She cried until she had no tears left, and through it all he held her. When she finally pulled back, scrubbing at her wet cheeks with embarrassment, he released her but stayed close. "I should get back," Margaret said, her voice hoarse. "Supper will not cook itself." "Margaret." Ryder caught her hand, his touch careful despite his size. "I did not mean to upset you." "You did not. I mean you did, but in a good way." She looked up at him, at the concern in his unusual eyes. "No one has ever done something like that for me before, something just for me. It means more than I can say." His thumb brushed across her knuckles, rough callus against rough skin. "You work hard. You deserve to be taken care of too." The air between them felt charged, heavy with unspoken things. Margaret's heart hammered in her chest, and she was acutely aware of how close he stood, of the heat radiating from his body, of the way he was looking at her as if she was something precious. "I should go," she whispered, but she did not move. "Yeah," Ryder agreed, but his hand tightened on hers. They stood there in the dappled forest light, connected by their clasped hands and something neither of them was quite ready to name. Finally, Margaret took a step back and his hand fell away. "Thank you," she said. "For the gloves, for everything. You are welcome." She turned and hurried back down the path, her mind whirling. Something had shifted between them in that clearing, something profound and terrifying and wonderful all at once. She barely knew him, but she felt drawn to him in a way she had never experienced before. That night, after the supper dishes were washed and put away, Margaret sat on her cot and slipped on the gloves again. They fit perfectly, protecting her damaged hands with soft leather. She thought about the time and effort it must have taken Ryder to make them, the care evident in every stitch. She fell asleep with the gloves still on, feeling protected and cherished for the first time in her life. The relationship between Margaret and Ryder shifted after that day, becoming something deeper and more complex. He began staying for meals more often, always sitting at his corner table but catching her eye across the room, a small smile playing at his lips. She found excuses to linger when he brought game, talking with him about inconsequential things: the weather, the forest, the animals he had seen. She learned that he had come west after the war, unable to settle back into normal life after the things he had seen and done. He had been a soldier in the Union Army, fighting through some of the bloodiest battles. The wilderness offered him peace that civilization could not, a place where the ghosts in his head grew quieter. "You ever get lonely?" Margaret asked one evening as they stood outside the cook shack, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Ryder considered the question. "Sometimes. But loneliness is better than being surrounded by people and still feeling alone. That is worse." "I know what you mean," Margaret said softly. "I was loneliest living in the city, surrounded by thousands of people who looked right through me." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and his voice was rough when he spoke. "I see you, Margaret. I see you just fine." Her breath caught. "I see you too, Ryder." Something passed between them, an understanding, an acknowledgement of the connection growing between them. Ryder reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and brushed a strand of hair that had escaped her bun back from her face. His fingers lingered against her cheek, calloused and gentle. "You are beautiful," he said quietly. "Want you to know that, not just pretty. Beautiful." Margaret's eyes filled with tears again, but these were different from the ones she had shed before. "No one has ever called me that." Then they were not paying attention. His hand dropped away and he stepped back, creating proper distance again. "Good night, Margaret." "Good night, Ryder." She watched him walk away into the darkness, her hand pressed to her cheek where he had touched her, her heart full of feelings she barely understood. As spring deepened into summer, their relationship continued to develop in quiet moments stolen between Margaret's demanding work schedule. Ryder began teaching her about the forest on her rare free hours, which plants were edible, which tracks belonged to which animals, how to read the weather in the sky and the behavior of birds. He was patient and thorough, his voice losing its gruff edge when he spoke about things he loved. In turn, Margaret found herself sharing stories she had never told anyone, about her childhood in the Pennsylvania textile mills, about her mother's death, about the grinding poverty that had defined her existence. Ryder listened without judgment, his presence solid and comforting. "You survived," he said after one particularly difficult story. "That takes strength most people do not have. I did what I had to do." "That is strength, Margaret. Do not diminish it." One Sunday afternoon in late June, Ryder appeared at the cook's shack with an unusual request. "Come with me. Want to show you something." Margaret hesitated. She had bread rising and supper to prepare, but something in his eyes made her nod. She left a note for Hank, removed her apron, and followed Ryder into the forest. They walked for nearly an hour, climbing steadily upward. Ryder led the way with confident ease, occasionally reaching back to help her over difficult terrain. His hand would engulf hers, pulling her up steep sections with effortless strength, then releasing her once she was steady. Finally, they emerged from the trees onto a rocky outcropping. The view took Margaret's breath away. The entire valley spread below them, a patchwork of forest and meadow, with the distant town of Jordan Valley visible as a smudge on the horizon. Mountains rose in every direction, their peaks still dusted with snow despite the summer heat. "I come here when I need to think," Ryder said, settling onto a flat rock. "Wanted to share it with you." Margaret sat beside him, her shoulder nearly touching his. "It is incredible, like being on top of the world." They sat in companionable silence, watching hawks circle on thermal currents far below. Margaret felt at peace in a way she rarely did, as if this place and this man had somehow quieted the constant anxiety that usually hummed beneath her skin. "Margaret," Ryder said eventually, his voice serious. "I need to tell you something." Her heart jumped. "What is it?" "I am not good with words, never have been, but I need you to know." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "You have changed things for me, made me realize how lonely I had been, even if I told myself I was fine. I look forward to seeing you every day. I think about you when I am out in the woods. He turned to face her fully. "I want to court you properly if you would allow it." Margaret stared at him, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. "You want to court me?" "Yes. I know I am not much. I live rough, do not have fine manners or fancy things to offer, but I can provide for you, I can keep you safe. And I will spend every day trying to make you happy if you give me the chance." "Not much," Margaret repeated, almost laughing. "Ryder, you are the best man I have ever met. You are kind and strong and gentle. You see me as a person, not just a woman to be used. You gave me gloves." Her voice broke on the last word. "You have already made me happier than I have ever been." Hope blazed in his eyes. "Is that a yes?" "Yes," Margaret breathed. "Yes, I would very much like for you to court me." Ryder's face split into a grin that transformed his usually serious features, making him look younger and almost boyish. He reached out and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "I will do right by you, Margaret. I promise." "I know you will." They sat there holding hands as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, neither of them wanting to break the spell of the moment. Eventually, they had to return to camp, but something fundamental had changed between them. They were no longer just two lonely people finding comfort in each other's presence. They were courting, with all the promise and possibility that entailed. News of their courtship spread through the logging camp quickly. The men treated Margaret with even more respect once they knew she was Ryder's girl, and no one dared make inappropriate comments in his presence. Hank Miller approved, telling Margaret that Ryder was a good man who would treat her well. The courtship progressed slowly by necessity. Margaret's work kept her busy from before dawn until late evening, and Ryder had his own responsibilities. But they found moments together, breakfast conversations that stretched a few minutes longer than necessary, evening walks around the perimeter of the camp, Sundays spent exploring the forest. Ryder kissed her for the first time on a warm evening in July. They were standing outside the cook's shack, the sky painted in shades of purple and pink. He had been telling her about a bear he had seen that afternoon, and she had been laughing at his exasperated description of the animal's antics. The laughter faded as their eyes met and held. "Can I kiss you?" Ryder asked, his voice rough. "Yes," Margaret whispered. He cupped her face in his large hands with infinite gentleness and lowered his mouth to hers. The kiss was soft and sweet, a question and an answer all at once. Margaret's hands came up to rest on his chest, feeling his heart hammering beneath her palms. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard. "Been wanting to do that for weeks," Ryder admitted. "I have been wanting you to," Margaret replied, making him smile. They kissed again, longer this time, deeper. When they broke apart, Ryder rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm on her face. "I am falling in love with you, Margaret Norton," he said quietly. Tears pricked her eyes. "I am falling in love with you too, Ryder Fallon." As summer progressed into autumn, their love deepened and grew. Ryder began building an addition onto his cabin, planning for a future with Margaret. She helped when she could, learning to handle tools under his patient instruction, their hands working together to create something new. In September, Ryder asked Margaret to marry him. They were at their special place on the mountain, watching the sun set over the valley painted in fall colors of gold and crimson. He pulled a simple gold band from his pocket, one he had traded furs for in town. "It is not fancy," he said, suddenly nervous. "But it is new, never belonged to anyone else, just for you like those gloves. Will you marry me, Margaret? Will you build a life with me?" Margaret looked at the ring, at this strong, gentle man who had shown her what it meant to be truly cared for, and felt joy bubble up inside her like a spring. "Yes, yes, I will marry you." Ryder let out a whoop that echoed across the valley and swept her up in his arms, spinning her around. She laughed, clutching his shoulders, feeling lighter than air. When he set her down, he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, catching the last rays of sunlight. They married in October at the small church in Jordan Valley, with half the logging camp in attendance along with various townsfolk who had come to know and like them both. Margaret wore a new dress, the first new dress she had ever owned, made by Mrs. Henderson with fabric Ryder had purchased. It was simple but lovely, a deep blue that brought out her eyes. Ryder wore a new shirt and had trimmed his hair slightly, though it still brushed his collar. When Margaret walked down the aisle and saw him waiting for her, tall and strong and looking at her like she was the only woman in the world, she felt her heart might burst with happiness. They spoke their vows in clear, steady voices, promising to love and honor each other for all their days. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Ryder kissed her thoroughly, to the whoops and applause of the congregation. The celebration afterward was rowdy and joyful, with food and music and dancing. Margaret had never danced before, but Ryder guided her through the steps with surprising grace for such a large man. They stayed until late evening, then finally escaped to begin their journey up to Ryder's cabin. It was a clear night, the stars brilliant overhead as they rode double on Ryder's horse. Margaret leaned back against her husband's chest, marveling at how that word sounded in her mind. Husband, She had a husband. She had a home. She had someone who loved her. The cabin was small but well built, tucked into a clearing with a creek running nearby. Smoke rose from the chimney, and warm light glowed from the windows. Ryder had come up the day before to prepare everything. He dismounted and lifted Margaret down, then surprised her by sweeping her up into his arms. "Tradition," he said with a grin, carrying her over the threshold. Inside, the cabin was warm and welcoming. He had built new furniture to accommodate her: a larger bed, a proper table and chairs, shelves for her things. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, and candles added soft light. It was simple but beautiful, made with love and care. Ryder set Margaret on her feet and suddenly seemed nervous. "I want—" He paused, running a hand through his hair. "I want you to be happy here. If there is anything you need, anything I can do to make it better, you tell me." Margaret reached up and cupped his face in her hands, still protected by the gloves he had made her, which she wore whenever she needed to work. "I am already happy. Happier than I ever thought possible. You have given me everything I needed, Ryder. A home, love, a place to belong. You have given me yourself, and that is more than enough." He pulled her close, kissing her with a passion that stole her breath. "Love you," he murmured against her mouth. "Love you so much, Margaret. Show me," she whispered. He did, with gentle hands and tender kisses, treating her like she was something precious and breakable, even though she had proven her strength time and again. Their wedding night was sweet and passionate, a joining of two lonely souls who had finally found home in each other's arms. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the big bed, Margaret's head pillowed on Ryder's chest as he ran his fingers through her unbound hair. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting flickering shadows on the log walls. "What are you thinking?" Ryder asked softly. "That I never imagined I could be this happy. That I never thought someone like you existed. That I wake up every morning half convinced this is all a dream." His arms tightened around her. "It is real, Margaret. You are my wife, and I am your husband, and we have our whole lives ahead of us." "Our whole lives," she repeated wonderingly. "Together." "Together," he confirmed, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. Life in the mountain cabin suited Margaret perfectly. She continued cooking at the logging camp through the fall, though she and Ryder discussed her eventually stopping to focus on their own homestead. Ryder trapped and hunted, trading furs in town for supplies and money. They worked side by side to prepare for winter, cutting firewood, preserving food, making their home comfortable and secure. On her first Christmas as a married woman, Ryder gave Margaret a leather-bound journal and a pen. "For writing down your recipes," he said. "But also for writing down anything else you want, your thoughts, your days, whatever matters to you." Margaret stared at the beautiful blank pages, touched beyond words. "I am not much of a writer." "Does not matter. It is yours to fill however you want." He paused. "Everything you own should be new, made just for you. Starting with those gloves and that ring and this journal. You deserve new things, Margaret. You deserve everything good." She set the journal aside carefully and climbed into his lap, wrapping her arms around his neck. "I have everything good right here." Winter in the mountains was harsh but beautiful. Snow fell deep, transforming the forest into a wonderland of white. Margaret loved it, loved the cozy evenings by the fire with Ryder, loved waking up warm and safe in their bed while wind howled outside, loved the quiet intimacy of their isolated life. In February, Margaret realized she was pregnant. She waited until she was certain before telling Ryder one evening as they sat by the fire. He had been carving, working on a wooden spoon, and she had been mending his shirt. "Ryder," she said softly, "I have something to tell you." He looked up, immediately focused. "What is it?" "I am carrying our baby. You are going to be a father." The knife and wood clattered to the floor as Ryder stared at her, his expression stunned. Then joy spread across his face like sunrise, and he crossed the distance between them in 2 long strides. He dropped to his knees in front of her chair, his large hands gentle as they settled on her still flat stomach. "A baby," he breathed. "Our baby." "Are you happy?" Margaret asked, though she could see the answer in his face. Happy does not even begin to cover it. He looked up at her, his eyes bright. "You have given me everything, Margaret. Love, home, purpose. And now a child. I do not deserve you, but I swear I will spend the rest of my life being worthy of this gift." "You already are worthy," Margaret said, running her fingers through his hair. "You are the best man I know, Ryder Fallon, and you are going to be an amazing father." He pulled her down into his arms, holding her close, and she felt the dampness of his tears against her neck. This strong, tough mountain man was crying with joy, and Margaret loved him even more for it. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through spring and into summer. Ryder was attentive to the point of being overprotective, insisting Margaret take things easy, constantly worried about her well-being. She found it endearing even when it drove her slightly crazy. "I am pregnant, not made of glass," she told him one day in May when he tried to stop her from carrying a water bucket. "I know, but I want to take care of you. Let me take care of you." She softened at the vulnerability in his voice. "You do take care of me, every single day." "But I am strong, Ryder. I can still work and help and be useful." "You are useful just by existing," he said seriously. "But I understand what you are saying. I will try to pull back a little. Thank you, though I will admit it is nice being fussed over. I never had that before." As her belly grew round with their child, Margaret found herself feeling more content than she had ever imagined possible. She quit her job at the logging camp in June, and they focused on preparing for the baby's arrival. Ryder built a beautiful cradle from pine and lined it with furs. Margaret sewed tiny clothes from fabric she had purchased in town, each stitch made with love. Mrs. Henderson came to visit in July, bringing gifts for the baby and offering to stay when Margaret's time came. The 2 women had become friends over the past year, and Margaret was grateful for the older woman's experience and support. Their son was born on a warm evening in early September, just as the first leaves were beginning to turn. The labor was long and difficult, but Margaret was strong, and Ryder never left her side, holding her hand, wiping her face, murmuring encouragement. When the baby finally arrived with a lusty cry, Mrs. Henderson placed him in Margaret's arms. "You have a son," she said with a warm smile. Margaret looked down at the tiny red face, the perfect little fingers and toes, and felt her heart expand in ways she had not known were possible. "Hello, little one," she whispered. Ryder leaned over them, his face full of wonder as he gently touched the baby's cheek. "He is perfect." "Margaret, he is absolutely perfect." "What shall we name him?" Margaret asked. They had discussed names but had not settled on anything definite. Ryder looked at his son thoughtfully. "What about Daniel, Daniel Fallon?" "Daniel," Margaret repeated, testing the name. "I like it. Daniel Fallon." The baby's eyes opened briefly, dark and unfocused, before drifting shut again. He was beautiful, whole and healthy, and theirs. Mrs. Henderson stayed for a week, helping Margaret learn to nurse the baby and recover from the birth. Ryder was a devoted father from the start, taking over all the household chores, pacing the floor with Daniel when he cried, staring at his son with awestruck wonder. "I never thought I would have this," he confessed one night as they lay in bed with Daniel sleeping in his cradle beside them. "A family, a wife and child who are mine. After the war, I thought that kind of happiness was not meant for men like me. Men like you are exactly who deserve happiness," Margaret said firmly. "You are good and kind and strong. Our son is lucky to have you as a father." I am the lucky one. You both are miracles to me." As Daniel grew from a newborn into an infant, their little family thrived. The cabin that had seemed plenty big enough for 2 people felt cozy and full with 3. Ryder's love for his son was fierce and tender, and watching him hold Daniel in his massive hands with such gentleness made Margaret fall in love with him all over again. Life fell into new rhythms. Margaret's days revolved around the baby, nursing and changing and caring for him, while Ryder provided for them all through hunting and trapping. They worked as a team, supporting each other, sharing the joys and challenges of new parenthood. Daniel was an easy baby for the most part, healthy and curious. He had Ryder's gray-green eyes and Margaret's blonde hair, and he smiled early, lighting up whenever his parents came into view. Margaret wrote in her journal about every milestone: his first smile, the first time he rolled over, his first tooth, his first word, which was "da," much to Ryder's delight. When Daniel was 6 months old, they went to town for supplies. It was Margaret's first trip since before the baby was born, and she was excited to show off her son. The townsfolk made a fuss over Daniel, and Mrs. Henderson insisted they come for dinner. As they ate around the Hendersons' table, Margaret looked at her little family and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. She thought back to the woman who had stepped off that stagecoach 2 years ago, alone and frightened, wearing a dress more patches than original fabric, owning nothing new and expecting nothing better. That woman would hardly recognize the life Margaret lived now. She had a husband who loved her fiercely, a beautiful son, a home of her own, and best of all, she had learned that she was worthy of good things. Ryder had taught her that with every gift, every gentle touch, every time he looked at her like she was precious beyond measure. "What are you thinking about?" Ryder asked quietly, noticing her expression. "Just how much has changed, how happy I am." He reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb brushing over her wedding ring. "Me too. Every single day, I thank God for that stagecoach bringing you to Jordan Valley. Best thing that ever happened to me getting on that stage," Margaret agreed. Winter came again, and they settled into hibernation in their mountain cabin. Snow fell deep, and they were isolated for weeks at a time. But Margaret did not mind. She had everything she needed right here: her husband, her son, their warm home, and the peace that came from knowing she was truly loved. Daniel took his first steps on a cold February morning, tottering between his parents with a delighted giggle. Ryder caught him and tossed him in the air, making the baby shriek with laughter. Margaret watched them play, her heart so full it ached. That night, after Daniel was asleep, Ryder pulled Margaret into his arms. "Want to tell you something." "What is it?" "Been thinking we should add on to the cabin, make it bigger, maybe another bedroom, a proper kitchen for you. Are you planning on filling those bedrooms?" Margaret asked with a smile. "If you are willing. I would love more children with you, Margaret, but only if you want that too." She kissed him softly. "I want that. I want lots of babies with you, Ryder Fallon." He grinned and kissed her back, deeper this time. "Then I better start building." Over the next year, Ryder expanded their cabin, adding 2 more bedrooms and enlarging the main living space. Margaret was pregnant again by summer, and this time the pregnancy felt easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect. Their daughter was born the following March, a tiny thing with dark hair and Ryder's strong features. They named her Caroline, and she completed their family in ways Margaret had not known were missing. Daniel was a doting big brother, gentle with his baby sister under his parents' watchful eyes. Ryder was just as tender with Caroline as he had been with Daniel, though he joked that having a daughter terrified him more than any bear he had ever faced. "She is going to have me wrapped around her little finger," he said, cradling the sleeping infant. "She already does," Margaret replied with amusement. As the years passed, their family grew and flourished. They had 2 more children, another son named Thomas and a second daughter named Elizabeth. The cabin that Ryder kept expanding echoed with laughter and the sounds of children playing. Margaret's days were full and busy, caring for 4 active children, managing the household, and helping Ryder with various tasks around their homestead. But even amid the chaos of family life, Ryder and Margaret made time for each other. He still gave her gifts made just for her hands: a beautiful sewing box, leather-bound books, a coat that fit her perfectly. Each gift was a reminder that she was seen, valued, cherished. And Margaret gave him gifts too, though hers were less tangible. The gift of her love, the gift of their children, the gift of the home she made for him. She made sure he knew every day how much she appreciated him, how much she loved him, how grateful she was for the life they had built together. On their 10th anniversary, they stood on the rock outcropping where Ryder had first asked to court her. The children were staying with the Hendersons in town for the night, giving Ryder and Margaret a rare evening alone. "Remember the first time we came here?" Ryder asked, his arm around her waist as they looked out over the valley painted in autumn colors. "I remember everything about that day. I was so nervous, so hopeful. I had never felt the way you made me feel. You changed my life, Margaret. You took a lonely, broken man and taught him how to live again, how to love, how to hope." He turned to face her fully, his hands framing her face. "I love you more now than I did 10 years ago, and I will love you even more 10 years from now. You are everything to me." Tears slid down Margaret's cheeks, but they were happy tears. "And you are everything to me. You showed me that I was worth something, that I deserved good things. Those gloves you made me all those years ago were not just gloves, Ryder. They were a promise that someone saw me, really saw me, and cared enough to create something beautiful just for me. You kept making that promise every day since, and I will love you forever for it." They kissed as the sun set over the mountains, 2 people who had found each other against all odds and built a love that would last a lifetime. The years continued to pass in a rhythm of seasons and celebrations. Daniel grew into a tall, strong boy who loved the forest as much as his father. Caroline was fierce and independent, always exploring and asking questions. Thomas was gentle and thoughtful, while Elizabeth was pure joy, laughing at everything. Margaret watched her children grow with a mixture of pride and wonder. They had never owned anything second-hand. Every piece of clothing, every toy, every book was bought new or made specifically for them. They would never know the shame of wearing cast-offs or making do with less. Ryder made sure of it, working tirelessly to provide for his family. But more than material things, Margaret and Ryder gave their children something far more valuable. They gave them a home filled with love and security. The children grew up watching their parents' affection for each other, learning what a healthy, loving marriage looked like. They saw how their father treated their mother with respect and tenderness, how their mother supported and cared for their father. It was a foundation that would serve them well in their own lives. When Margaret was 37, Ryder 42, they found themselves with an unexpected 5th child. Margaret had thought she was done having babies, but apparently life had other plans. She was nervous about having another baby at her age, but Ryder was thrilled. "One more blessing," he said, his hand on her belly. "One more piece of our love walking around in the world." Their youngest son, Samuel, was born healthy and strong, and his older siblings doted on him. Margaret looked at her family gathered around the fireplace one winter evening, everyone there together, and felt such overwhelming gratitude that it brought tears to her eyes. "What is it?" Ryder asked softly, noticing her emotion. "Just thinking about how blessed we are, 5 beautiful children each other, this life we have built. Sometimes I still cannot believe it is real." "It is real," Ryder assured her, pulling her close. "And you deserve every bit of it, Margaret. Never forget that." As their children grew older and more independent, Margaret and Ryder found themselves with more time for just the two of them. They still took walks in the forest, still sat on the rock outcropping watching sunsets, still held hands like newlyweds. Their love had matured and deepened over the years, becoming a steady constant that anchored both their lives. Daniel was 18 when he announced he wanted to become a logger like the men his mother had once cooked for. Ryder helped him get a position at a camp farther north, and Margaret packed him food for the journey with tears in her eyes. Her firstborn, grown and leaving home. It was the natural order of things, but it hurt nonetheless. "He will be fine," Ryder assured her, holding her as they watched Daniel ride away. "We raised him right. He is strong and smart and good. I know it is just hard letting him go. We still have 4 more at home, and Daniel will visit. He is not gone forever." Over the next several years, they watched their children grow up and begin their own lives. Caroline married a young doctor and moved to Portland. Thomas took over the homestead when Ryder decided to slow down, building his own cabin on their land with his new wife. Elizabeth became a teacher in Jordan Valley. Only Samuel remained at home, still young and full of dreams. Margaret was 52 when she and Ryder celebrated their 30th anniversary. They had grown older together, their hair graying, their faces lined with years of laughter and love. But the connection between them was as strong as ever, maybe stronger for having weathered 3 decades of life together. 30 years, Margaret marveled as they sat on their porch watching the sunset. Where did the time go? "Into building this," Ryder said, gesturing at the homestead, the life they had created. "Into loving you. Best 30 years of my life, Margaret. Mine too." She looked down at her hands, still protected by leather gloves when she worked, though these were a newer pair Ryder had made to replace the originals when they finally wore out. Her hands were old now, marked by age and work, but they were cared for, protected, cherished, just like her heart. "Remember when I first gave you those gloves?" Ryder asked, following her gaze. "Every day. I still have the original pair, you know, too worn to use, but I could never throw them away. They represent the moment everything changed for me." Ryder took her hand, threading his fingers through hers as he had done thousands of times over the years. "You changed everything for me too. I was just existing before you, going through the motions. You taught me how to truly live." They sat in comfortable silence as the sky turned from gold to pink to purple. Samuel came out to join them, now a young man of 15, and they made room for him between them. Margaret leaned her head on Ryder's shoulder, her son's hand in hers, and felt complete. This was what she had never dared dream of all those years ago when she stepped off that stagecoach in her patched dress, carrying everything she owned in a small bundle. A family, a home, love that lasted, and the knowledge that she was worthy of good things. The seasons continued their endless cycle, and Margaret and Ryder grew older together. They became grandparents as their children had babies of their own, and the cabin filled with the sound of young voices again during visits. Margaret loved being a grandmother, loved spoiling the grandbabies and watching Ryder play with them with the same gentle patience he had shown their own children. When Margaret was 58, she fell ill with pneumonia during a particularly harsh winter. For several terrifying weeks, Ryder feared he might lose her. He barely left her side, caring for her with devoted attention, refusing to even consider a world without her in it. "You are not leaving me," he told her fiercely one night when her fever was at its worst. "I need you too much. Our children need you. Our grandchildren need you. You stay with me, Margaret. You stay. Whether it was his words, the excellent care he provided, or pure stubbornness, Margaret pulled through. As she slowly recovered, Ryder held her constantly, as if afraid she might slip away if he let go. "I am not going anywhere," she assured him. "I have too much to live for. You better not. I cannot do this life without you. You will never have to. We made a promise, remember, to love each other for all our days. I intend to keep that promise." By spring, Margaret was fully recovered and back to her normal activities. The illness had scared them both, reminding them of their mortality and the preciousness of each day together. They made a pact to appreciate every moment, to never take their time together for granted. Their oldest son, Daniel, brought his family to visit that summer, and the cabin was full to bursting with people and noise and love. Margaret stood in the kitchen preparing supper with her daughters and daughters-in-law, surrounded by the next generation, and felt the circle of her life complete itself in the most beautiful way. That evening, as the family gathered around the expanded table Ryder had built to accommodate everyone, Margaret looked at the faces of her children and grandchildren, at her husband sitting at the head of the table with baby Samuel Jr. on his lap, and felt tears prick her eyes. "Why are you crying, Grandma?" Caroline asked with concern. "Happy tears, sweetheart. Just thinking about how blessed I am to have all of you." "We are the blessed ones," Daniel said. "You and Pa taught us what love looks like. You gave us a foundation we could build our own families on." "Your mother did that," Ryder said, his voice rough with emotion. "She took a broken mountain man and taught him how to be human again. Everything good in my life stems from her." "You saved me too," Margaret said softly. "You showed me I was worth something, that I deserved to be loved and cared for. Those gloves you made me all those years ago changed my life, Ryder." Their children looked at each other, confused. "Gloves?" Thomas asked. Margaret smiled and stood, walking to her bedroom. She returned carrying the original leather gloves, now worn almost translucent in places, the stitching frayed. But she had kept them safe all these years, wrapped in cloth and stored in her trunk. "Your father made these for me before we were married," she explained, laying them gently on the table. "They were the first new thing I had ever owned in my life. Everything before that had belonged to someone else first, but these were made just for my hands. They represented your father's love and care, and they showed me that I deserved good things." She looked at Ryder, seeing tears gleaming in his eyes. "They were a promise that I would always be cherished, always protected, always loved. And your father has kept that promise every day for 33 years. The children and grandchildren looked at the worn gloves with new understanding, seeing them for what they represented. The foundation of their family, the beginning of the love story that had created them all. "That is the most romantic thing I have ever heard," Caroline said, wiping her eyes. "Your father is the most romantic man I have ever known," Margaret replied. "He just shows it through actions rather than words." Ryder cleared his throat roughly and stood, coming around the table to pull Margaret into his arms. "Love you," he murmured into her hair. "Love you so damn much." "I love you too," Margaret whispered back. Their family watched with smiles and happy tears, seeing the depth of love that had sustained their parents through 3 decades of marriage and would carry them through whatever years remained. As the years passed into their 60s and 70s, Margaret and Ryder slowed down but never stopped loving each other with the same intensity that had defined their relationship from the beginning. They spent their days working on the homestead with Thomas and his family, playing with grandchildren and eventually great-grandchildren, and enjoying the peace that came with a life well lived. On their 50th anniversary, the entire family gathered for a celebration that lasted 3 days. There were children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren everywhere, filling the expanded homestead with noise and chaos and overwhelming love. Margaret and Ryder sat in chairs of honor while their descendants toasted them and told stories and thanked them for the legacy of love they had created. 50 years, Margaret said wonderingly as she and Ryder finally had a moment alone together. Half a century of loving you. Best 50 years possible, Ryder replied, his hand finding hers with the automatic ease of decades of practice. And I would live them all over again exactly the same way if I could. Me too. Though maybe with less pneumonia, he laughed, the sound rich and warm. Deal. Less pneumonia, but everything else stays the same. They sat together on their porch as the sun set, their hands intertwined, their lives completely interwoven. Margaret looked down at her aged hands, bent with arthritis now, and noticed Ryder had made her a new pair of gloves to accommodate the changes. These were lined with soft wool for warmth, the leather supple and flexible. Made just for her hands, just like the first pair, just like every pair he had crafted over the years. "You are still making me gloves," she said softly. "Always will as long as I can. Your hands are precious to me. Everything about you is precious to me. I love you, Ryder Fallon. I have loved you since you pulled me onto your horse all those years ago. I will love you until my last breath and beyond. And I love you, Margaret Fallon. You are the best thing that ever happened to me. My wife, my partner, my everything." They kissed as the sun disappeared below the horizon. Two people who had beaten the odds and built a love that would last through eternity. Their children and grandchildren watched from windows and doorways, seeing the love that had sustained their parents and grandparents through 5 decades. The love that had created this large, sprawling, beautiful family. Margaret and Ryder lived many more years together, each one a gift. They grew old side by side, their hair white, their bodies slower but their hearts still strong. They continued to make each other laugh, continued to hold hands, continued to love each other with the fierce devotion that had always defined their relationship. When Margaret was 78, Ryder 83, they sat together on their porch on a warm summer evening. The homestead was quiet for once, with no visitors scheduled. It was just the two of them, as it had been at the beginning. "Remember that first day?" Margaret asked, her voice softer now with age but still clear. "When you gave me a ride to the logging camp, I remember thinking you were the bravest woman I had ever seen. Walking 15 miles in worn-out shoes, carrying all your belongings in a carpet bag, ready to face 30 rough men all alone. You impressed me from the first moment. I was terrified, but I was also desperate. That job was my last chance. Best thing that ever happened to both of us, you taking that job." Ryder squeezed her hand gently. "I had given up on finding someone to share my life with. Then you stepped off that stagecoach and everything changed. The gloves changed everything. You saw me, really saw me, and you cared enough to make something beautiful just for me. No one had ever done that before. No one had ever made me feel valuable. You are the most valuable thing in my life, Margaret. You always have been." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Margaret felt tired in a way that had nothing to do with the day's activities and everything to do with the accumulated years of a long life. But she felt no fear, only contentment. She had lived a good life, a full life surrounded by love. "Ryder," she said softly, "thank you. For what? For everything. For seeing me, for loving me, for giving me a life I never dared dream was possible, for our children and grandchildren, for 56 years of happiness. For making gloves for my hands." Her voice broke on the last words. Ryder pulled her close, his arms still strong despite his age. "You made my life worth living, Margaret. You gave me purpose and joy and love. I am the one who should be thanking you. Then we will thank each other for a life well lived, for a love that lasted. They held each other as the stars wheeled overhead, two souls so intertwined that they were almost one person. They had built something beautiful together, a family, a legacy, a love story that would be told by their descendants for generations to come. Margaret and Ryder lived to celebrate their 60th anniversary, surrounded by an enormous family of children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. It was a joyous celebration full of love and laughter, and Margaret felt her heart might burst with the happiness of it all. That night, lying in bed together as they had done for 6 decades, Ryder pulled Margaret close. "No regrets?" he asked. "Not a single one. You?" "Only that I did not find you sooner. But we had the time we had, and I would not trade a single moment of it. Neither would I. You made me happier than I ever thought possible, Ryder Fallon. You showed me what love really means. You showed me too. You saved me, Margaret. In every way a person can be saved." They fell asleep in each other's arms, as they had done countless times before. And when Margaret passed away peacefully in her sleep 3 months later, Ryder held her hand one last time, tears streaming down his weathered face as he said goodbye to the love of his life. But even in his grief, Ryder knew how blessed he had been. He had loved Margaret for 60 years. He had built a life and a family with her. He had shown her every day that she was worthy of new things, of beautiful things, of being cherished and protected and loved, and she had shown him the same. The gloves he had made for her all those years ago, the gloves that had started everything, were placed in her hands before she was laid to rest. They had been her most treasured possession, the physical representation of a love that had transformed both their lives. Ryder lived another 2 years after Margaret's death, cared for by his children and surrounded by family. But part of him was gone, buried with his wife on the mountain they had loved. When he finally passed away at 85, his family buried him beside Margaret, reuniting them in death as they had been in life. Their youngest son Samuel, now middle-aged himself, stood at the grave site with tears streaming down his face. "They loved each other so much," he said to his siblings. 60 years, and they never stopped looking at each other like they were the most precious thing in the world. "That is the legacy they left us," Daniel said, his own voice thick with emotion. "They showed us what real love looks like, what commitment means, what building a life together means. And it all started with a pair of gloves," Caroline added, remembering the story their mother had told so many times. "Made just for her hands, the first new thing she ever owned." The family stood together around the graves of their parents, united in grief, but also in gratitude for the love story that had created them all. Margaret and Ryder's legacy would live on through their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, through the example of love and devotion they had shown throughout their long marriage. Years later, when the great-grandchildren asked about their great-grandparents, they were told the story of how a lonely mountain man had seen a woman in need and made her a pair of gloves, how that simple gift had sparked a love that lasted a lifetime, how 2 people who had nothing had built everything together through love, hard work, and unwavering devotion to each other. The story became family legend, passed down through generations. The tale of Margaret, who had never owned anything new before, and Ryder, the mountain man who had surprised her with something made just for her hands. It was a story of love conquering loneliness, of 2 broken people making each other whole, of a life built on the foundation of mutual respect and endless affection. And somewhere in the mountains of Oregon, where the wind whispers through the pines, and the sun sets in brilliant colors over the valley, the spirits of Margaret and Ryder walk together still, holding hands as they had in life, their love eternal and unbreakable. their story a testament to the power of seeing someone truly and loving them completely. Their homestead stood for many years, maintained by their descendants, a monument to the love that had built it. The cabin Ryder had expanded room by room to accommodate their growing family. The cleared land where their children had played. The porch where they had sat countless evenings watching sunsets together. And in a place of honor, preserved carefully, the original leather gloves that had started it all. Now a family heirloom representing the moment when everything changed for two lonely people who found each other in the wilderness. The gloves were carefully displayed in a shadow box, mounted on velvet, with a brass plaque telling the story. Made with love by Ryder Fallon for Margaret Norton, spring 1878. The first new thing she ever owned, the beginning of a love that lasted 60 years. Family members would visit and look at the worn leather, marveling at the craftsmanship, touched by the love they represented. And every time someone in the family needed a reminder of what real love looked like, they would remember the story of Margaret and Ryder. The woman who had owned nothing new, and the man who made sure she knew she deserved everything. The mountain man with gentle hands and the brave woman who saw past his rough exterior to the beautiful soul beneath. The love that started with gloves and grew into something that would last for generations. It was a love story worthy of the Wild West, full of courage and hardship, survival and triumph, loneliness conquered and joy discovered. But most of all, it was a story of two people who loved each other completely, who built a life together one day at a time, who never stopped choosing each other no matter what challenges arose. Margaret had stepped off that stagecoach in Jordan Valley, Oregon in 1878 with nothing but a worn carpetbag and fading hope. She had walked away with everything that mattered: love, family, belonging, and the knowledge that she was worthy of all the good things life had to offer. Ryder had given her that gift with a simple pair of leather gloves made just for her hands, and she had given him the gift of her love in return. It was more than enough. It was everything. It was a love story that would echo through time, inspiring everyone who heard it to love a little deeper, hold on a little tighter, and never underestimate the power of a simple gift given with love. The story of Margaret and Ryder Fallon, the mountain man and the woman who had never owned anything new, proved that the best things in life are not things at all. They are the people we love and the life we build with them, one precious day at a time.